surpassed penetrating and perfect karma is rarely met with even in 100,000 billion kalpas. Having to see and listen to, remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Here in the Zendo and online. Some of you I know will have heard parts of those before, but some of you might not have. So I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible, but here we go. So we've started a new thing where we're trying to give titles to our Dharma talks. So the title of this Dharma talk is Majapajapati, Yashodara, and the 500 Women. And it's really interesting. I started reading this little book, which is poems of some of the first Buddhist nuns, and then going forward. And I came across a little passage in here about this group called the 500. And I'd never heard that term before. So I'm going to kind of explain a little bit about that and who they were and why this group formed. So just to give a little backstory, the Buddha himself was born, give or take, 400 BCE. Might have been as early as 600, but we'll say 400. He was born into this clan called the Shakya clan. So sometimes you hear him referred to as Shakyamuni Buddha, which means sage of the Shakya clan. So Shakya clan was his clan. The capital city of this clan's territory was Kapilavastu. So it was an actual pretty good-sized city. And Suddhodana was the king. And Suddhodana was the father of Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha. So he was the prince and the heir apparent of this Shakya clan. There's also a neighboring clan called the Kolyan clan. And this is the clan of Mahamaya and Majapajapati. Mahamaya was the biological mother of the Buddha. And both of the sisters were married to the king, Suddhodana. The Rohini River forms the boundary between the territories of these two clans. That'll be important here in a second. Anyway, Mahamaya is the senior wife. She's the first wife. And she was the biological mother of Siddhartha Gautama, and she died about 7 days after his birth. After her death, Majapajapati, her sister, became the senior wife. But Majapajapati already had a son by this point. But because she wasn't the senior wife, at the time that he was born, he was not considered sort of like the heir to the throne. Okay? He was not the next king. But after Maya's death, she became the senior wife, and she was chosen to bring up the infant son of Mahamaya, as well as her own infant son. So she later also had a daughter. But and then Siddhartha Gautama, so he was born, he was raised then amongst sort of in the women's quarters, among his the other young children of the area. And it turns out that a lot of these people that they talk about at this point in time as his childhood friends, some of them were even born at exactly the same time that he was born, were later his companions throughout the sutras and throughout the stories of his life. So at some point, and I think a lot of people know this story, a visiting sage kind of predicted that Siddhartha would grow up to be a holy man, a holy leader. And the king of the Shakya clan thought that was a terrible idea because he wanted this kid to grow up to be the king of the Shakya clan. So he made sure that he was going to have no reason to leave the palace. And so he protected him from seeing anyone who was sick, anyone who was dying, anyone who was dead. Sickness, old age, and death were not something that he was even introduced to. So the other thing was that, of course, he was provided with a harem. And they talk about this at length in this book. This is called Stars at Dawn. And this is actually a book that's based on 10 sources, heavily on 10 sources that they're not new, but they're recently available. And they are Sanskrit rather than Pali, and most of them, and they just talk about these things like it's like normal business. We really don't have a lot of knowledge of that time period of his life. So he was so spoiled and so, we'll just say spoiled. He was just provided with so much that when his father went to sort of ask around trying to find him a wife, most of the men with sons in the area said, no, he's a spoiled brat. He won't make a good husband or father. But eventually he did meet Yashodara, and they were married when they were about 16 years old. So she became the senior wife of Siddhartha. Later there were junior wives, at least 2. Those 7 different women are named throughout these sort of sources, but there's never more than 3 women named at a time. So some of these names might be referring to the same women. So we never really think about this, but this is what his life was like. He was raised to be royalty. So, and he was following the same practices as everyone else at that time. And so he had this great, huge community of women that the locals had provided to the palace, and the harem life was not good, according to sources. It was basically slavery. And so even though it was something that everybody did, and these women had a life where they were protected in some ways from a lot of things, but they were also pretty much slaves. So at some point during his life, he decides that this is kind of not the life he wants to be living. So he's around 29 years old at the time when he requests, and a lot of you know this, to go out into the city. He hasn't been allowed to do that. And when he goes out into the city, there's several different versions of this story. One where it all happens on the same trip out into the city, one devastating trip, and another where it happens over time. But he goes out and sees a sick person, an old person, a dead person, and then a mendicant, a traveling monk. So at that point, this was such a shock to him he had no idea, and he'd gotten to be 29 years old and hadn't really thought about the fact that he was going to die. Yeah. And so he was so just traumatized by this, that this was really kind of what led him to leave home and become a religious figure in that area. So what he did was, they talk about this as they call this the Great Departure. When he left home, he sort of snuck off, and then there was all this just chaos after he left. I mean, what's Yashodara gonna do? He had a son that he left behind also, Rahula, and so there was all of this, okay, now what are we gonna do? Chaos in the wake of him leaving. Because he told in advance, I mean, he messages were coming back to the palace. Sort of people were reporting back to the king about what he was doing during this time. And so one of the things that he did work with various teachers in several different religious traditions, the Jains, for example, but he ended up deciding to become an ascetic, which is this, the people who have the idea that really depriving the body of pleasure is the way to reach enlightenment. And so he was, at one point, they say he was subsisting on 1 sesame seed per day. I think that's such an odd thing, but I love it. And during this time, Yashodara is also practicing the same thing, and sort of in the hopes that her husband will come back to her and sort of restore the order to what's going on. So everyone then kind of knows the story. He became unbelievably weak after several years of starving himself, and he was found next to the river by a young girl who offered him a bowl of milk, rice milk, which he took and drank because he knew that what he was doing wasn't working. And that's sort of his story of how he came upon the idea of the middle way. And once he recovered his strength a little bit, that's when he went and sat down under the Bodhi tree and decided he wouldn't move until he finally reached an understanding of the true nature of reality. So that's a summary kind of the story. And for me now, this is where I kind of really think it becomes interesting. So as he kind of becomes, so now he's the Buddha, an enlightened being, and he's continuing to travel, and he starts teaching eventually. Not sure he should at first, but eventually he decides that he will. And he starts to establish a monastic community. Well, the monastic community, it turns out, consists of mainly of people who were serving him from before, from his previous life. So they're members of the Shakya clan who left home to follow him. Some of them left the palace, some of them left their families. At a certain point, he kind of went back to Kapilavastu to talk to his dad, and Yashodara had big hopes that he was back to stay. He was not, but he did come back and ordain Rahula. And so his son goes with him to the monastic community, and a huge number of members of the Shakya clan also left with him to go back, become part of the monastic community. The king had to make a rule that only 1 man per household could go, 1 male per household. So many people wanted their sons to go, so many men wanted to leave home. And so it's just a huge social upheaval. And there's lots and lots of women who become sort of quote unquote widows. Okay? And they're not really widows. Their husbands have just left and gone to become monks. So they're sort of officially widows. At that point in time, they basically fall under the care. There's no sort of mechanism. They don't have anything set up for taking care of widows. So Majapajapati steps in and starts to provide financial support for these women and make sure that they've got some sort of protection. The next big event then in this sort of story is that there's a dispute over the Rohini River. So Majapajapati is from the neighboring clan. So the Buddha is also, related to those folks. I mean, his mother came from that clan. There's a dispute over the river, and a lot of people die. So the Buddha comes back to sort of mitigate this conflict. And this time, a whole bunch of men from the other clan follow him. Okay. So now there's real widows from this conflict. There's widows who have been left at home, and they're all turning to Majapajapati and Yashodara for support. And they're getting it until the king dies. The death of Suddhodana was just the cap on this thing, where now there's absolutely no one to take care of any of these women. No one. There's no heir to the throne. It's a big dispute with the relatives. When he came back to mitigate this river conflict, that was the first time that Majapajapati asked for ordination. She asked to join the order, and he said no. So now that Suddhodana now has died, she's like, okay, well, that's it. We don't have anywhere else to go. None of us. So she packed them up, and those are the 500. All of these women that she'd been supporting. The women living in the palace, the harem, the junior wives, all of the women who'd been widowed. These are the 500. And Majapajapati had been taking care of them this entire time. Yashodara stayed behind to sort of continue to soothe things over. So the monastic community at this point had moved on to Vaisali, and they all decided to walk. So what they did was they shaved their heads, they put on the saffron robes, and they walked to Vaisali. It took them months to get there. Months. Now, just to back up a little bit, the term 500 is a term that they used a lot within this literature. There was 500, there wasn't clear, probably there was there was definitely some other number of people. It could have been 600, it could have been 300, but they always use that sort of as a way of saying it was a lot. So what they did along the way, they dressed as monks and they lived basically as monks along the way. They walked, they begged for food, and they were supported by the communities that they walked through because they were clearly religious travelers. So when they get to Vaisali, they're all bleeding and crying and exhausted and hungry and tired. And Ananda sort of meets them at the gate and is very distressed by this state of these women. I mean, these are, his grandmother, and So Mahapajapati asks again for ordination. She's told no again twice. On the third time, Ananda intervenes and begs for him to allow it, and he does. And the interesting thing about this ordination, there's a lot of theories about why he didn't want to ordain women. Mainly, most of the theories come down to he didn't want to ordain women because he was worried that it would make everybody mad, and also worried that he wouldn't be able to protect them. But these women, the whole Shakya clan is already there. I mean, these women are going to live with their male relatives, their sons, and they have nowhere else to go. And so he finally decides, and Mahapajapati then is put in charge of the women's order. And according to this stories that I've read, the women are all given 8 special rules that they have to live with that only apply to women. They are basically make them subordinate to any monks in the community. That may or may not be true, but some of those rules are still in effect for some sects of Buddhism. Eventually, Yashodara also comes and becomes ordained, but she is so beloved and famous that she eventually has to just hide. She has to move to escape from it because she's so overwhelmed with gifts, all of these things that make her really stand out from the others who are there, that she moves to a different temple, even though she has been ordained. So this is sort of, I just am fascinated by this idea that, I mean, I've always kind of felt like, oh, that's not so cool that he left his wife and son and took off to live this life. But it was so much worse than that. And I mean, I can understand fully why, I mean, he was not going to be able to become a religious leader in the context that where he was before. He had a life that he wanted to live. He was really trapped in this royal life that he didn't want. So I can understand completely walking away from that. The problem is that, you know, everyone else said, oh, okay, I want to walk away from it too, or whatever. You know, it just created a huge amount of social upheaval. And it ended up being that the Shakya clan was, eliminated with warfare within a very short period of time after all of this occurred. So the Shakya clan is no more. And it just was really, devastating. And so it kind of makes you really think about some of the things that we've been talking about in our discussion group about how, even though we know about the ultimate nature of reality, we understand about emptiness, we do our best not to create suffering, but sometimes we do, because that's what people do. And it's kind of good to see that, the Buddha was a human being who made choices that had consequences, and he ended up, having to live with them, despite trying to not live with them. He ended up having to take responsibility for things that he didn't want to have to take responsibility for. And I think that's just a really great thing for us to think about and look at and understand, and not avoid thinking about because it's uncomfortable, which I think a lot of us do. this isn't important, I don't want to think about this doesn't apply to us. But I think we should think about it, because we ourselves are also going through our lives creating situations and suffering, and whether we meant to or not. And this model of sort of, in the end, taking responsibility for it is a good one. Anyway, that's all I wanted to share today. Just thought it was an interesting story, and even though it's legend, so it's all exaggerated, and there's pieces here that are true and pieces that are probably not true. Still, it's a good story, and there's something for us to learn from it, still. That's all I have to say today.
Please turn to page 12 in the Zendo, page 19 online.
May the merit of this penetrate into each thing in all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha way. Sentient beings are numberless,